3.3 million viewers watched the first episode of Snowpiercer on TNT. But will they be back? This week, we have another episode of Snowpiercer, the second episode, and this episode was titled Prepare to Brace. And I'm going to give my thoughts on it with spoilers, in case you're wondering. So if you haven't seen the episode yet, you might not want to watch this until you have. Or if you don't mind spoilers, go ahead. But before I get into that, if you're new to the channel and you're interested in seeing more of my reviews of other shows and occasionally movies and books, then I highly recommend subscribing. I'm going to be reviewing the new National Geographic series, Barkskins, sometime tomorrow. I'll be putting that review out. So if you're interested in seeing that review and other reviews on this channel, please consider subscribing. So getting into this episode, I'm really not convinced that I'm going to keep watching this. If you're interested in having me continue reviewing it on a weekly basis, despite the fact that I just keep bashing it, let me know in the comments. I'll definitely take that into account. But I kind of feel like my initial thoughts on this show are pretty correct. So you can watch my review of the first episode if you're curious about what I said about that episode. But this episode specifically, we had some suitably brutal scenes. We had the arm smashing, which comes straight from the movie, which I just rewatched, so it's very fresh in my mind. And we obviously had the scene where the cows froze to death because the car got breached by the avalanche. And I just think that scene in particular was cool, but it was definitely emblematic of the flawed logistics of this show. Now, the movie was never intended to be like a realistic sci-fi concept. It was obviously more intended as a social commentary, but they put a lot more thought into how the train would function than this series clearly does. There's just so many questions that go unanswered here, and I don't even feel like they're really trying, which is interesting because a lot of these questions were answered in the film. So to me, they could have just cribbed what the film did, because they're already cribbing the entire layout of the train from the film and obviously from the graphic novel that inspired it, I believe, although I have not read that, so I don't know how much of what was in the film originated with Bong Joon and how much of that was in the original graphic novel. But to me, it's just copy what worked in the film. You don't have to start from scratch. Just make sure we understand everything that the film established. Now, I'd be interested to know how many of you are watching this without having watched the film and how many of you watched the film before you watched this. But to me, I feel like if you haven't watched the film, there's a lot of logistical questions that they don't really take the time to establish here. And this is doubly bad because you don't have the symbolism or the deeper subtext that you saw in the film. So to me, that ameliorates some of the criticism of the lack of logistical logic, because you're like, okay, well, this wasn't intended to be completely a logical sci-fi concept. It was intended to be more of a social commentary. This episode, we had a lot of things that harken back to the movie. As I mentioned, the arm smashing scene, which wasn't nearly as viscerally stunning as it was in the film, but it was well enough done for a TV show. But, to me, we also had some scenes where they're getting into the themes of the film, or they're having scenes that are directly from the film, such as Andre's speech where he talks about the cannibalism. But in the film, they just had a lot more weight, and they helped to really establish the themes of the class warfare. And here, everything is just on the nose. Like I said, there's no subtext. For instance, you have in the final scene between Andre and Mr. Wilford, played by Jennifer Connelly, he talks about how when he looks at the train, he sees a fortress to class. And that's just way too on the nose. I mean, yes, that is what this train is supposed to be. And, obviously, a train is not the most subtle metaphor for a class system. I mean, you literally have classes of passengers on a train, much the same way you would have on a plane. But this is just saying it's a fortress to class is just way too on the nose, in my opinion. And boy, I mean, the cannibalism speech, I really thought Daveed Diggs acted it well. and it was probably the highlight of the episode for his character. I felt like he really established the difference between the people in the back of the train and in the front of the train, how the people in the front of the train have the luxury of looking down at that kind of behavior, but the people in the back of the train have to do it to survive. And, in the film, I feel like they did a better job of explaining why the cannibalism is important. It wasn't just there for shock value. It was showing how when you're a poor person and you're in the lower classes, you literally have to feed on your fellow people within that class in order to survive. Whereas here it was just kind of I felt like it was just largely done for shock value. But Daveed Diggs, like I said, he acted the scene very, very well. But overall, other than Connelly and Diggs, I just feel like this cast is really, really bland. They're not really making good use of Alison, Wright, or any of the other actors that are recognizable to me. And I really have to question what the Mr. Wilford twist at the end of the first episode really added. Like, I feel like the whole point was that Mr. Wilford can be hiding in plain sight, and, get it, he's a woman. So they continue to call him Mr. Wilford, but it's a woman. But what is this really adding? I think that the whole idea of having, being, Batman in plain sight or Zorro in plain sight or whatever, other person hiding in plain sight and talking about yourself is that it gives you some advantage tactically, but we don't really see what tactical advantage that this gives Wilford. So it wasn't a great twist because to me it didn't really add any layers of meaning. It was surprising, and I kind of liked the idea of Jennifer Connelly as Wilford, but what is this twist adding other than to be a twist? This episode also just had a ton of generic investigation scenes. It just felt like an episode of Law and Order or CSI. We had, the autopsy scenes where they go on about the body and what it says about the crime, and then we have the generic interrogation scenes, and they've done a decent job of establishing Andre as a decent investigator. He definitely has good deductive skills and he's good at his job, but this is such a lazy plot line for this type of show. Who cares about a murder mystery on a train like this? It's just not an interesting idea. And obviously we have more plot line with the ex-wife. We have flashback scenes giving a little bit more of their backstory. But again, so generic, so uninteresting when you're on this train, which is such an interesting concept, and you're going with the most bland, generic plot lines that you can think of. The nightclub scene with Lena Hall, to me, this was just I think some people will find it interesting. And it was, better than if they had just done it in a dark, dimly lit train room, but I have no suspension of disbelief that they're actually shooting this on a train. In the original Snowpiercer movie, you could see the trains in the background kind of tilting and moving as the train tilted and moved. And to me, they don't have any of that level of detail here. It's just it doesn't feel like they're on a train at all. You can totally tell it's just a cheap set. So the production design is just terrible in my opinion. And the song that Lena Hall, who is a Broadway singer if you don't know, was singing during that scene was not a nightclub song at all. It was such a pop song, and not a good pop song either. And final thoughts, there's no subtext to any of the scenes or the dialogue, as I said. I appreciated the final confrontation between Andre and Mr. Wilford. I thought that was one of the better scenes in the episode, but overall I just felt like there wasn't a lot going on here. And, the scene with the cows getting frozen to death, that was probably one of the more chilling scenes, get it, pun, in this episode. But to me, it also just hurt the logistical aspects of the show, because you have this show where it's this train is supposed to have been going around the world for decades. And how is that supposed to happen when the slightest avalanche can breach a car and people have to cross through these cars to, go to the front or the back of the train? That just doesn't make any sense, because if you could get breached by an avalanche that easily, the train would never have been able to be on the track for decades. It just doesn't work. So those are my thoughts on the second episode of Snowpiercer. Again, let me know if you want me to keep reviewing this show or if you're ready to quit with me. And as always, you can watch more videos right now.